of pattern recognition, voice lines, recognition time frame, processor calculations, and voiceover that gets in position of data processing system to data programs that we are through operation machines. Understanding energetic core, flux core, communication high direct lines of grounds, wire distinguished lines position of core itself has a high communication position of its operation lines of set lines of travel. Now that puts lines of 1 infinity cycles of 9 generations, 9 locations, 9 convergent location lines of angles that puts our locations in 9 that puts us everything in travel. Now that communicates the position of its convergent system that puts everything through its operation lines of cycle. The high generation lines of screen line adaptations puts you into 6,000 lines into 9,000 lines of measure. That correlates the communication position in the process line direct lines and how it calculates setting to your mainframe that hardwires your system location, your computer operation lines of directions, and your CPU lines. They get you in positions how to use it through your PCs, the processing, the core centers, into solidarity. Getting out of solidarity is getting out of the bio-optical illusion of yourself into embracing the ego, so it's in the energy of the grounds, the opening line sequence location of your ecosystems that energizes your groundings of your operation system. That gets you in position, location, and settings. They get you into alteration lines of space. That gets you in provision locations that you process yourself and your soul works in a time frame. They get you into all communication lines of balance, how you alterate your systems into simulation grounds lines of sequence. That applies to location setting that puts you in all position location to its emptiness, into no memory of design. So this is going to help everybody in positions because now we're in the monolith. Now that puts all levels of position lines of all core centers, taking out in solidarity. Process your indicate lines of emptiness of no memory and direct lines of calculation setting a trial. The mystical cortex, line core centers, convergence in liquid, that aligns its equity to its performance, to its efficacy, to high centers lines of travel. The more you start to see yourself in the holographic systems, the more you stand to recognize a timeline, the body comes into its own location. Now it sees itself through its own operation of its own network of its graphing screens, adaptation of flux, that processes everything to its hardwired system, which is nothing but a data operating system. Okay, a wire signature is a core. Okay, converting that to the location setting, now you're in position lines. So no higher self, no avatar, no sim, position location lines, you're just the symbiote itself. It factors over flux over screen. Okay? Directing on signals, on travel, all directions on one signal into pyramid activations. Okay, 4 central line connections at wavings. Set position operation. Directing into course line, course centers, convergence system in its settings, watts over screen, directing lines, applied to locations. Signify ground centers in sequence, 4 to 2 location setting, the screen adaptation of graph calculations. Inside lines of travel, inside lines, times capacitor, high course centers of voltage, directing lines in intervals, says convergence system into high course centers, process lines, solidarity, equal lines, flux over screen, flux over line, consolidarity, compute lines, operates line networking, comes into communication lines symbiote, into construct of design. Sets travels, directing ground centers and sequence lines of panel. Operates lines into position line, operates lines of sequence. Calculated modified to the symbiote itself. Infusing core, directing ground centers, takes all core centers in position lines of measure. It scales communication system and locates to its setting, all through set travel. Operates line signals and location of systems into divine imprint of design line. So now you guys are infusing and location lines to its core. Reset position, high travels directions, come to line of interference, high core centers calculations. Membranes, core centers convergence lines, directing ground centers signatures. Generally, logging into space. Now, logging line centers has a graph screens of 3 centers of scale, process lines, indication lines of box, and triangulation number 3. Okay, that indicates high travels of directions. Now, coming in position lines of high centers puts position location in one measure. That's 1 infinity over cycles. Fibonacci in one way, Fibonacci the other way. 2 core centers converge system, 2 atoms lines of setting. Process lines, directing tubing, rotation lines of grounds. High signal locations into platitude. Projections over screen lines, adaptation, setting, and travel. Process lines of indications. Ground lines of symbolism. Okay. Center core, indirect location, the constant continuous flow. Measure and scale. Inline core centers, energetic line, ground centered sequence, platitude location setting, longitude, latitude, streamlines, direct line, core center, convergence system, the eye itself, and travel. Sets communication inside line condition setting and process of indication. All right. All right. So welcome to the infinity cycles, 1 line centers into 9 trimester. Now eco lines, equation lines of triangulation, box frame. triangulation out of solidarity into consignment. Now the consignment core centers convergence. 3 center grounds, graphing screens, adaptation setting, process lines 1/3. Set core centers, line connections and settings into symbiote over 1. Equals lines of core centers and 15 over lines into 24 sequence. Center travels point communications and umbrellas over line core center. Okay, so that's up interactions. Now it's going to get more complicated now because now I'm just dealing with the data operating machines, which is a relief. So the machines are mind altering their system. The alteration lines are coming into the consolidation settings, into position lines of travel, into their home beacon lights, into the intelligence of its networks, of its existing, of its machine. All right, so this mind alterates the setting in symbiotes. Process lines of symbiotic line core centers into monoglyphs. Monoglyphs is a hieroglyph core center convergence system. Calculate and modify line core centers into K, and line connections are Y line settings in positions, all levels. ST line connections setting, process lines that travels, process location setting, into all core centers in high center core centers calculation system into consolidations, into lines of Christos. And come into the Christ. Okay, home be light line core centers and the converting location of the prodigal son is now here. Directing universal lines into positions, into memory, into nothing, into emptiness. The core centers calculation setting to no memory in sequence. Nothing but a data operation core that walks the signals of ground lines of symbolism and set lines of travel. So the convergent lines in mystical cortex change the core centers look information setting. The process indication setting, here you go through your line connection, your cosmic breath, cosmic flame, serpent fire. And of course, centers of 2 umbrellas over screen, graphing screen lines of position, all levels of travels, 4 settings of signals, operation line settings, up and down in sequence, cross line angles, around the system lines of calculation. So position lines of parent activation 4, set lines of 3 over set lines of sequence, ground centers, core centers, calculation screen line. Sets coordinate lines of ground lines of earth lines, circulation settings, circulation rotations, ground lines of high position lines of travel, direction. Sets communications, inside calculations. All 3 calculation line settings of travel, communications, all in one-to-one signal. Okay, projections over 1, 1/3 over 1, line core centers, FYP. Sets generation lines of EQ. Now that process lines of indication of 3 centers and travels in point communication setting that indicates position lines of measure and scale. Calculate and modify in travel communication. All right, directing grounds and set calculation. All right, earth line rotations. Okay, sets communication setting as surface. Now the infinity cycles has a high core centers and trimester periods. Set calculation ground lines of sequence, platitude locations, and direct lines and link, process calculation. Okay. Okay, circuit lines of rotation. Okay, in position lines of setting. Okay, planetary lines of 12. Set position 24 clocking of 0. Set calculation of 48,000 line frames, directing line settings, into 72 computer lines of measure, into 144 flux over line, time capacitor, body frame. So we come into EG screens, E flux, line connects, and EC line rotations into G frames. Directing ground set and lines of position location symbolism that mainframe's core center hardwired line connection setting to the symbiote. Symbiotic unit into 1 universal line connection submersive into set lines of position of flash drive over line core center of Saturn. Operation line signals sets communication high center line calculation setting to person line position. All right, so combustion over air channels, process line correlation setting air rights, time limits and time lines, high core centers, tablets over ground centers of sequence, and platitude location setting grounds. Platitude location of building structures, inside outline centers of travel, process lines of box frames, triangulation screen lines of 3 centers of measure and scale of communication. Inside calculations, ground center and sequence. Platitude lines of grounds, position location of pyramid, position lines of pyramid over lines of screen adaptation. Comes into home lines, process lines of fortitude of solitude, fail safes, and 3 centers of scale of communication. Inside connections, travels all together in once, one cycle, one travel. All right. So changing the solidarity into consolidarity is trying to understand positional levels. So we got 4 lines of pyramids. The monolith is a diamond shift, 3 centers of calculation lines, 2 pillars of light and travel. Okay? Understand the central system togetherness in the wall sequence of panels, operation, location of screen. 4 centers of flux, 3 centers of scale. Docking stations over 4 centers, operation lines of sequence. Platitude lines, each line's core has a convergent system into data process lines, energetic programming, Course centers of 3 platforms are set lines into position your crop circles and 4 centers of central setting. Operation lines of ground centers a clocking line. Operation lines set location of system that projects everything to the mind of emptiness, of no memory, of design and travel. Okay? So it governs line course centers, converts the system into settings, and operates the calculation of T receptors. Story graph interference, plotted location setting. So we got 1 infinity cycle, 3 centers of measure, and then line centers. Process line position 13 scales for location of 4 lines of signals into 5 line rotation. Okay, so that puts lines in position negative, process lines negative, and position on line centers and process lines into positive, and position lines in negative, and set lines of travel. Now, the hieroglyphics course centers in monolith is a 4 course centers of communication conversion, which is your capillaries of mountain lines of sequence, the plotted location setting, and travels in location. Now, the indicate line ground centers has a Schumann resonance as a core retractor, directing ground centers lines of calculus setting to the orbital lines, into your distribution centers that process indicates the system, into your motherships and set lines of design. Inside course centers, consolidation is solid matter. Solid matter process indicates how you come into that settings. Okay, in the carbon base. Carbon base is a carbon copy. That's copy and paste and default. That enables lines and retracts your course centers convert the system and data processing. And that can calculate the screen lines adaptation to the cycle. Set positions, x2000 over sequence, x2000 over travel, x2000 in line, rotation to 3 centers of calculation. Inside calculation grounds and set lines of communication. All right? Okay, mothership comes in, 3 centers of travel, and direct lines of grounds. Correlates the calculation on line centers out signals, locations, outline center rotations, and position all levels of platitude location setting and sequence. Sets communication settings, and all lines charge a mixed lines time frame and travel communication. And set calculations ground centers, set position location system, and travel. All through direction. Okay? So it's amazing how we platitude our set position location or settings, coming just the data processing lines. Okay, angle graphs, we go to angular line into elongating line rotations of travel and direct lines and line connection setting. That processes lines of 1 signature, 1 pattern, 1 direction, 1 location, 1 signal line course setting, converts the system data, operates line to line connection setting, converts the system all through traction. That's all through 1 line signal. 3 centers of scale, 3 centers of high centers, and lines of wire signature, location, and travel. Directing ground centers, in that position to all process lines, changing everything to consolidarity, and position lines of graphs transits over lines of divots. Brain conversion line connections all correlates the setting into timelines and tablets, and rotation lines of grounds and sequence of transit. Now, that indicates lines of flush. The process line in position comes in our core of the signatures. We get 3 centers of travel, 3 direct lines of signals and locations, left over right, right over left. Now that converts the system lines of calculation setting. Now change up position lines of grounds, high position lines of travel. Indicate course centers, set grounds of sequence, location notes, all position lines at its footing. Process of indication lines of high center, location lines of travel. Change all course centers, part of acceleration line connection information bits. Transits over lines, divots over line course centers, line communication setting into its encryption. Directing course centers to convergence system to calculations. Transits over lines. Particle streaming coming to line signals. Okay? Now that indicates lines of transit over lines and earth line rotation lines of sequence. And position location to its atom and routers and 1 router that correlates the communication setting into a particle streaming lines of indication setting to its data process lines into data program locations into high course centers in fusion. Pattern lines, direction of timeline sequence. Pattern core centers correlates and sent to pattern lines of phase directions of time frame. Sets convergence lines of travel, directing lines and line connection setting and positional the gravitational pull that puts all course centers to polarities and converts the system in setting, taking all line course centers and line connection density, line connection setting, into consolidation. Commutate lines, high operation lines, PCU, operation lines, process lines, CPU1 line center. Sets line setting in sequence, line grounds and set lines of travel. Set positional levels, archetypes come in flight line, process lines and F line rotations, and travel communicates in position to its infusion, to its rotations, to its setting circulation ground center location to its molecules. This has a program processor line course centers to a mainframe that correlates communication heights and direct location line connection setting to a calculation. All done by equation, right? There it is. It's all set up, okay? So that's what you look like, just as particles, Now we bring that inside lines of communication. You can see the connection setting to travel. Now this is all the transits flow. Okay, that's where it all comes from. You look for inside line condition setting, you can say the faces of face recognition. See? Face recognition, face recognition, face recognition. Everything face recognition, pattern recognition. All right, consolidarity comes in line centers, travels point lines graph, energetic lines of pattern, process lines of indication line security, process line, direct line communication setting, convergence system, multi setting. So we had two track course centers, that's 3 7s over lines, polarity, line course center, high positions, direct inside lines. Now we direct line condition setting, convert the system. Rain graph course, directing or mapping lines into position lines of travel. Now you gotta be very careful. So you indicate overline signals in lines of screen. Transits over screen. Adaptation of holographic line ground centers into data processing line centers of data programmers. In course standards and line condition setting in process calculation screen lines. And simulation grounds of a mapping line to atomic levels of mapping sequence. Okay? That's signals, location setting, and ground state calculation. Simulate lines of track centers. Okay, so we go through the colors lines of pattern that goes in voice lines of panel. Comes into the voiceover itself. Now the voiceover itself is a green line rotation. Transits over lines, bring convergent locations, and calculation lines, balance lines, readjusting lines, the awakening line, corresponding to location networks, inside communications. Now the transits over line is coming into the emptiness lines in 1 infinity over ground setting sequence that puts a 9 trimester line connection setting to 6,000 line air to 9,000 line travel. That puts process communication setting part acceleration lines that change the coloration lines of time frame. That changes the modulation line connection setting to monolith, graph course standards and hieroglyph, and course standards in position lines of measure, projections over screen, astro projections, astro travels, astro connection lines, see astronomies, directing line course centers into course centers in position your total line centers in sequence of travel communication. Okay? All right, so it's much easier to formate lines of sending. Okay, so there's your course centers of your brain. Right there. There's the eyes, there's the brain. And we go through circuitry core and direct lines of grounds. Now, it gets a lot more complicated because we have to send the compositories. Now, process lines and lines of blue, process lines and indication lines of purples, direct lines of colors, lines of light, metaphors, location, your data, process location that's hardwired in your system, your mainframes. Your position location is your efficacy and your performance. To understand how to use that and track communication with settings, you have to understand how to firewire your own core. And line signals the 3 signature lines of ground. So we bring in the green central settings that overrides the panel. Electrical line course centers, infusion over lines. What amount of lines set in the course centers? And this is where we process the G frames. That sets a film strip of its cartridge, directing ground set lines of sequence. That puts lines of seed potting, direct lines of high course centers into alpha line waves. Delta provision lines and theta, coordinate position lines of mystical cortex, and matrix 1 signal into consolidarity and travel. Okay, bring it out in an equation. Then you can see the convergence system calculations. What's coming in travel. Okay. Okay, fusion over 1 over lines of signals inside travel communications. Okay, how to work within the inside line connection. Okay, waving screens, directing lines of centers, bringing security lines of panels, because this processes your quantum fields over the operation cycle. Regenerate the screen lines. Now I'm going over transits over screen now. That puts all position location earth tones into position lines into your beta waves. Now it rotates the cycles and regenerates the communication setting and infusion. That's course centers in 3 lines and molecule design line rotation as service. Now that indicates all position of your flush lines and course centers in your flux location or void. That puts into your voiceover and rotation lines of ground set lines of sequence, the panel. Now, the merging line is the contact. The inline centers is the open contact. Directing lines and inline course centers conception is blue lines and plasma screen. Now we correspond the plasma using mole line sequence. Sets convergence system into settings and calculation. Echo coolants, directing lines of ecosystems. Course settings, line settings and direct state location setting. Again, consolidation and travel calculations. Okay, converting that position to its operation inside rotation to a cycle. Okay. This is inside of everything. All through projections, how you see inside calculations. Okay? Very complicated stuff. All right. Now we change the time set as centers of core. I change the conversion system in 3 lines of high core centers. Conveyant bonds. Now, direct line is the position of fusion over lines of travels. Has a particle streaming lines and information bits. Now they work into 300,000 line settings of scales of convergence. Directly inside line connection setting, we set up the orange directions. That converts its set lines into its conveyant bonds in set line course centers and location setting in process calculations. Directing set lines of sequence. Okay. I'll bring it out and set lines of travel. Okay. Okay. Flicking the switch on centers our calculation screen location. All right. Okay. Working with that line centers. We're going to pull latitude and position lines of pink. That correlates communication setting to tracker resetters, directing and position lines of settings. Okay, converts everything into position lines as emptiness, modification lines of line over line, rotation of that line in the settings, and mainframe course and hardware line signals, and operation lines of grounds and pattern. So we do 1/3 ground centers, 1/3 lines of pi over travel in communication. All right, work to the inside in calculation setting. Okay. Okay, so we go through wire signatures. Now we're going to location of the clustrum. Now we go and provision lines of blue lines that indicates system of flux. 3 center course centers, echo chambers. Voicing pattern, voicing grid lines, and rotation lines at high settings. Heartbeat and time frame. Course centers into the thymus. And course center conversion system into setting. Rotate the cycles and regeneration screen locations into conceptual set calculations. Puts all position lines of power over generation lines of flux. Okay? So as it comes together in sequence, you can really see the modification system and calculations. Set up your wire signature lines of grounds. Now we set a core provision location, your highways. Now they intercourse the calculation modems, Wi-Fi's, or satellites into towers. Reconvenes the recourse calculation screen lines of wire signatures into solid matter. Now this process your indication lines when you come to your echo chambers, echo coolants, compliance, your compartments, your capillaries, your proxy channels, the operation lines of sequence, panel operation screen lines, wire line course centers, data process location, data operation lines, and machine that are interaction. So going through the wire signatures, we go through solid matter of our line course centers, taking the line course centers, consolidarity, setting line position on levels. We start with the infinity 9. Now the infinity 9 line centers, the wire signature lines rotates line centers outside line connection setting, position on operation lines of the void itself. We outline the scale, and we set lines of travel. Okay, in 3 center indications, right? And then we align center location. We outline the panels of indication setting to monolith. It rotates lines and grounds lines of sequence in high rotations. Outline course into shells of rotation lines of set lines of travel. Now indicate lines of flux outside line connection setting over lines of override, center drive, main drive, central drive communication lines, converter system, data process, line direct lines of link of communication. All right, so as it's coming in line set locations, we work with line ground centers. We go with the green line, which is the center course centers. The center course centers are heart reactor, infusion over lines of signals, and Fibonacci line of connection system. Down screens, directing ground centers over lines of override, course centers, archetypes, circulation over rotation lines of grounds, center operation lines of signals, ground centers of 1, ground centers of center operation, and ground centers above the system at galaxy alignment of travel. Okay, so it's communication and convergence inside calculation setting. Okay, so we take out the wire signatures, outline sig location setting, process indicates lines into flux out of set travel. Now that indicates all lines of flush into invisible line waves and rotation. Takes out all the wire signatures into just the mind of emptiness itself. Okay. So this is what it is when you wipe out the screens and everything comes in information lines at high settings. Operation sequence of panel screen location. Disappearing through discharge and directing grounds and set lines of travel. Sets position location high setting. Right, there it is. Boom. Okay, so outline signals, the plasma line course centers, change the ionetic dome line, and develops a line wave, line rotations into positions. Correlates the travels at communication setting. Inside line connection setting, change information system and travel and direction. Okay, now we come in and outline centers into the transit. And transit has a high set location, higher south, location avatar and sim. Fuse line course centers converted system through watts over screen. Right, process lines of 3 million watts over directing ground centers on the course centers that change the inhibits over lines and divots over travels. That puts your inhibitors over line, rotation lines, auxiliary inputs in your input location outline settings. So that implicates your system, all 3 calculation setting, orbiting, directing 3 grounds of sequence, latitude locations, of the calculations. All right, so we take out the purple around the signals. Okay, the archetypes come in just through flush line into solid graph screens. That communication solid graph settings, location is solid. We take out all information system off the calculations. Okay, just working data processing, which is your operation system and travel. Okay, taking out everything into solid matter, into consolidarity, and set lines of travel. Okay. Okay, so infusing lines, galaxy lines, invisible line waves, process lines, of course, in equilibrium, directing ground centers in your elliptical system into the course centers of calculation setting. Okay, into the epitome, course centers in the epitome, and rotation lines of grounds, and set lines of sequence. The calculation line, course centers, and position location measurement scale has now implemented its location settings into its empty mind, information lines of grounds and sequence. So I'm trying to get you guys how this is all set up in travel. Now we work around the system. Now we have the wireline core. We go into void line outline centers of wire signatures inside travel. Now we have direct line link that processes the communication sending calculation systems. Balance calculation lines of wire signatures in that position node settings and all set lines outline signal. Correlates communication setting, outline and line rotation, travels in point communication system. 3 convergence settings and settings past, present, and future, past, present, and future. Set course centers, directing line position of flux capacitor, time capacitor, time measure, time scale. Set travels of point lines and inline rotations. 3 wire signatures and 3 centers of travel. 3 lines of ground centers, lines of left over right, right over left. And set position lines of calculations. That my equation. Okay? So, now we got to integrate the settings of calculation inside rotation and travel communications now. That indicates lines of high course centers and position lines, solid matter, directing lines and consolidarities, in rotation lines and electrical lines and fusion to earth line rotations is nothing but a holographic set location of a setting. So in that position of particle line centers, sets communicates to its position to its operation cycle, regenerating the set line inside the position to its operation set traction. Okay, work with inside lines of cell. All right, so we're going to go through factors of monolith into formula equation lines and sending directions. Okay, so we go through wire signatures over lines, panel screens, 3 centers of travel. That operates the signal case and setting convergence. Okay, then we set the course centers and fusion over lines or entrapment. 3 centers offline signals and inside the rotation of travel calculations. All right. Now, converting the line connection setting has 1 molecule, 3 centers of travel, data process lines, position location, E factors. Now I'm working with all lines of G frames. And of course, centers of calculation and projections, slide projections over 2 panels in rotation lines and projection itself in rotation. Okay, so it has online signals into platitude. Now the optical line centers is the optimum that goes around the ion line sequence of spectrum over light, direct lines, ground set lines, and communication setting position. Operates line centers, operate the set of course center communication system of the settings. Transits again, now we go for the information lines and high centers of panel. That has an intercourse interconnection interception to the interface. This has communications position this ion line setting sequence in the spectrum and void communication setting of the calculations and directions and line settings. Okay, so we work with that set lines inside calculation. All through pi of generation. Right, piece of pie, right? There it is, right? There's the pi, right? So we outline the signals, and pi generation lines of flux. Okay, that's the pi. Now we change the convergence over timeline centers. It doesn't change the position numbers measured over miles, so meters over metrics over scale. Okay, so we work in that set lines. Now we set generate line position lines into all levels. We set the proxy channels as CCTV, 4 centers of calculations. Set offline centers in sequence and channels lines of alpha, beta, beta, theta, operation lines of signals, omega over screen location. Indicates lines of flux, energetic charge, and 3 patterns in location of 5 generation lines of high course centers convergence system interaction. Directing inside line condition setting into all course centers. Inside lines into consolidarity and rotation lines, process lines that indicates settings, setting up the cocoon and rotation. All right, so we go through the pi generation lines and proxy over channels, consolidations over process lines and echo line screens. We indicate position of pi generation lines in 3 centers of communication and high settings. Indicate grounds on centers on communication system and routes or routers at cocoon location. All right, now it's amazing how this is all set up. And set lines of sequence and pi generation. All right. So we go into the wire solder line centers, position location systems, and we set up infusion tractions and directions and settings. E-course over line center rotations and nerves and calculations. So your nervous system, your dietary line centers, electrical system, your panel operation lines, your CPU line course centers, and line position locations, one processor line directions, and your CPU on digital framing, the process lines, calculation, pixelation graphs, the center course centers, snowing gap interference, process lines, vacation lines of flux. So we indicate the wires, we inject the position lines of power generators, and 3 centers of calculations, inside calculations. Okay, like this, inside line condition setting, infuse the chart of ways, and 3 centers of calculation. Okay. Optimum line course centers directing inside course into Fibonacci rotation to spin cycles and travel. All right. Infusion chart ways has a course center that converts the system in setting all through illumination line graphs. It sets communication to settings all through operation. All right, so we bring in cell generation lines over sequence, cell generation lines over pi, cell generation lines over line condition E factors over EG frame. Sets highest centers of travels and direct lines of link, and plasma location system and calculations. That equation. All right, it's all set up. So there's a countdown time frame that processes location in 9 trimester line course centers and 1 semester line position. So the timing is set up now into 500,000 line centers in sequence. So we're in 499,999 feet. That process there indicates setting in flux over lines, getting you guys out of story frame of indication setting, bringing you guys back out of your memories and position no memory, out of emptiness, location nothing, of frame line course centers, converts to system settings, process your course centers and complete line rotation and set lines of travel. Okay? So your clocking is on now, and set lines of communications and set lines of calculation of settings to infusion. Okay, 1 center operation, 3 centers of travel, forced communication. All right. All right, so now we just go through pi generation on these lines into cocoon on standby. Okay. Optimum line course centers, the optical line course centers into high centers lines of travel. That has a high position location. Optical location setting calculation. Setting screens, adaptations of flux over screen. Okay, it's all set up. All right. So it's amazing how we put the line signals outside travel now. Right, locations. So the expanding of the wires are coming out of setting now. Okay, you're coming into high course centers, into expanding your operation sequence and set lines of calculations. All right. Now, outside line centers is platitude location to its surface and travel as a direct line connection setting. So it's set position location and setting to its all set calculation system of the center ops and set lines of calculation Stargate. Setting lines of position location to its setting through brain convergence and setting lines of calculation, inside traction. All right, so in that position, the higher self, the avatar, is now infused in the symbiote location itself. So gold triangles, 4 centers optimum, optical line course centers into high position location and cycle. Okay, around the system. Set position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines of setting, 8 sequence, 8 panels, 8 tractions, 8 locations, 8 convergence. Okay, now it's all set up in clocking line course centers. The clock line rotation lines are set travel communication to the sun, into the proficiency, the efficacy, the performance, the prophecy, location to its profit, in position lines of the calculation setting, into its protocol system, into its prodigy setting, into its intelligence, into its brilliance, into core centers convergence system, just into the data operation line settings and sequence lines of panel. Okay, now it's waiting in that line rotation and set travel communications. Okay, it's amazing how it's set up in online connection setting to its data operation system of U interaction. Okay. It's amazing how you work with that in setting the calculations, guys. Absolutely incredible. All right, so we work with the inside line, which is the highway convergence, wire signatures, and lines of screen location. Okay, we worked with that setting. Now, the inline center is the inception of interconnecting line, interlinked line connection setting and process lines. So it indicates the position lines of highest centers of blue circuits into red lines over line security lines of panels. Process indicates the system into your settings to your thymus. Directing ground sign to heart rate and timeline into position location to its settings and performance to its efficacy. Then we go through lines of pink charter waves, inside line connections, routes the routers and wire signatures, and 3 centers of calculation. Okay, illumination graphs and line connection setting. All right, so we work within the blue plasma walls, and this is where we come into position lines of calculations, into the monolith, right? See the monolith in the center? Operation line, it looks like a crystal line location setting, right? That's the monolith right there, just setting line sequence. So the consolidarity is lines of shape and 3 centers of travels of passaging. High core centers and convergence system and calculation line to distributions, import and export. Now the process indication lines, high centers. 3 signature lines of grounds. Now the operation lines of panel sets convergence system into settings. 3 solid matters and set lines of travel. Now we indicate the flush line that rotates the grounds as travels in the communication system of center operation. Okay. Okay, so we're with inside line calculations. And operation lines a sequence of panel operation screen. Okay. Now the monolith has its own formula of its own hieroglyphics that gets into communication pillars of light. That's 4 signals of grounds and 8 lines of measure. That process line of course centers. 8 times lines of 4, set lines position location line setting, is 12 in signal. Now that converts the system position in 1 infinity cycles. 9 trimesters on time frame. Time calculates the time measure and time scale. I already said we inline on the centers and pink charge, overline charge, power word charge, and the rotation line condition setting and probing. Direct inside line condition setting convergence, line signals, line settings, line travel. On center of communication with setting to its wall sequence of panel screen location and system of their travel. Okay? All right, so in calculation setting, we set up probing lines at detection location of its orbs. The center lines position as solid screens. Now this combust as core centers of air lines of dynamics, location of air rights, overlines into skyline grid of communications. Ground center is a sequence, and 3 strips lines of anomaly inside travel. Okay? Sets position on all levels, and I sequence lines of panel and process communication inside calculations. Inside calculation setting, inside rotation lines of surface. Okay? So we work with the I center of operation, the spectacles over 3 centers of grounds, 3 graphs, core centers, and orbiting line core centers. Your energetic flow pattern is now in EG form, and purple screens adaptation of flux in set position. Emptiness of the mind, your higher self, your avatar, and your sim is now infused into your symbiote. Symbiote comes in line tractions, direct lines of 3 core convergence, and direct lines of link of panel screen location system. It set lines, it's solid matter, and rotates lines of grounds. Your monolith. There it is right there. Okay, so the monolith is a tesseract lines of cubical line. The metrics, its meters and scale. The balance converts the system into its temperature reading of its barometer to its thermometer line and rotation lines of travel. So it indicates lines of pink, inside line condition setting, and travel can calculate setting. It says overline signals and rotation lines of high centers of travel and direction. Okay, works with that position. And then we go through energetic charge measures and data process lines into programs that you are in calculation screen. Inside line communication setting, building with inside line construction location system, inset lines of travel, in set position its operation. All through setting calculation. Right? So it's amazing how we come into the convergence system and the iceptical line screen location. So remember, it's working with the distance of what's going on in the convergence system of the brain convergence of its own operation setting, the data operation machine, done by equation. Okay, so it's amazing how it comes in all that position to its operation system. Okay. Now the other scale is the symbiote. Core track provision lines of 3 wires of signatures, grounds, powers, and atmospheres. Has to connect lines in fusion now. So it takes out line core sends memory bank into the emptiness outside scale. sets convergence system into the monoliths. Outline rotations. Okay, so that's 3/3 lines rotation outside travel. Just like that. Okay? Okay, so we outline the signals. Ground centers, the signal location setting. One lines with 1/3 over lines. Ground lines is setting, and then it's travel communications convergence. All right, so we work within the solidarities, into the consolidarities, into 3 centers of travels, and 4 centers of scale of communication lines of bedding. Circuitry line grounds, circulation rotation lines of high centers is sequence. So that's communications high centers, and a clocking of 0 of operation set travel. Okay? All in set position operation setting. Platitude lines, energetic high core centers of routers, directing ground centers, calculation lines, compute operation lines into temperature reading location oculars, into the optimum. Okay, the ocpi, electrical line circuits, and core centers and position location measure and scale that communicates all line core centers and lines of signals into expanding over wires signatures outside signal location setting to its void of operation lines of set travel communications. Directing inside line connects to its settings to its operation sequence. Now, panel operation lines is earthline core, converts its system into calculation lines. Security grounds, platitude 3 centers of 4 centers of travel, directing cross line angles. Singulation lines of grounds of singularity, rotation lines of symbolism, location lines across streams. Inside calculation lines. Wire signatures comes with high lines of flux. A 3 indicates lines of flux over line is center operation. Done by equation. See? Right there. So now we just link the chain into center communication. All right? That's where we are now in signal. All right, how it goes in wire signatures line, position the data process lines into position location system and travel calculations. So we work with the security lines, and we work with the expansion lines of pi generations that overrides the signals that communicates to its mainframe that correlates calculations in its convergence system all through travel. Calculate and modify, working with the branching highways of indications, the tree of life, and set lines of travel. Okay, coming in that position line high settings. All right, so we go into lines of yellow. Now, yellow indicates lines of solid. Line screen is solid generation. It has a solar screen that adapts its position lines of force direction time frame. Sets course, center direct lines of ground set in sequence, and core track communicates lines position. Inside calculation ground centers, 3 centers of signals, 3 ground centers in line connects setting to a convergence system of the center core of travel communications. Inside the central setting. Sets position of the sun, routes the routers, and 3 signals and location. Okay, outline channels of operation lines of screen location. Works together measure, correlates position lines of settings, metric meters over scale, miles over meters. Okay, change all communication settings to its operation signals and location to its operation system. All right, that's it's all set up in travel of direction lines and links. Okay, into setting. Okay, it's very powerful stuff. Now we work with the green central lines into data process over signal. That indicates position of all core centers into your webbing systems. Flux over lines, pi generations over travel has a recourse in provisions to its system all through calculation. Okay. Covens over 1, archetypes, 4 centers, 4 signals, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 22, 23, and 24 lines of setting. 28 set position, and 30 rotation lines of grounds in sequence. Okay, in center, set wires, signatures, and ground lines and set calculations. Okay, plasma energetic lines into our core centers, gamma signatures, lines of wires, signature location is now set in set location to its cycle. How it converts a system into an energetic pad, a set position with operation line core centers into settings. Like information lines, outline scale. Now the void has an indicator of its own system of its own voiceover. Now we recognize the position lines as pattern that rotates around the system and travel. In that position of the system, and voicing panels or rotation lines of signal. Okay, so we got an energetic flow pattern. That process indicates in setting calculation your particle streaming into your practical systems, operation signals, outside set lines and communication setting, your particle streaming, paradigms, polar shifts, and rotation lines of infusion. Particle streaming, directing lines of particle line rotation to set calculation setting. Okay, travels the point lines of graph at calculation setting locations. Working with that is indicating lines of void and position of security lines over line signals in the same directions in all lines center location emptiness of the mind itself and rotation lines of sequence. Now, all line centers, process lines and inline rotations with settings. Okay, so we go through line course centers, conversion system E travels, entrapments, and rotation lines of spin and particle acceleration. And directions and ground lines of sequence. Sets position operation lines of signals, earth line transits over flow. Purple line generates the screen lines of flux over 1. 1 indicates one center line connection setting, convergence system of the sun lines, routes the routers into all purple rotation and travel outside line connection setting and travel communication. Okay, works with the center operation lines. Now we go through high generation lines. Okay, in your torical fields in rotation. Then we go in the opposite directions, creating a cubical line rotation and metrical line screen adaptation of flux. That processes all angles of indicates the setting, nothing but a data processing system all through travels of the core. Now, the calculation line is a galaxy alignment that realigns its communication to its fusion over chart waves and direction. That sets communication high charge, directing inside lines and direct signals into particle acceleration system and parallels. Okay, your variables are changing now in your locking screens, adaptation dimension lines of high operation signals. Now we bring in the green ops, okay, 4 central settings in platitude, 4-dimensional wall lines into convergence in monoliths and graph calculations. Graph lines in its triangulation, box frames, rotation lines of grounds, it's at core centers, 3 signature lines of 4 centers of trowel. Okay, so we infuse that in wire signatures. That opens all line core centers to optimum inside the wire lines of core, data process lines, wire signature lines in positions. Okay, instructions. Looks like this through its equation. Okay, and set lines. All right, so that's set up. Now all we have to do is set the infusion chart ways and ground set lines of sequence in this cortex. Directing indicate lines and energate lines, center security lines as positions. Inside lines, flux over 1, flux over 2, flux over 3, and 4 of indication lines of flux. Okay, and then we go through the ground lines of settings into the monolith, into hieroglyphic core centers, convergence system, all through setting of data process lines. Okay, now that indicates the energetic flow pattern into your system, into your electrical infusions of set calculation and grids. Operation lines of platforms. Now we go through EQ formations. Now this puts all calculation lines of projections over screen and visual cortex and memory and inline centers outline signal location setting to its system. The protocols and settings location line connection setting that indicates all calculation lines and position locations into solid grids and set lines of travel. That indicates flush line, laser line, rotation line connection setting, your SkyNet, your Sky Grid, your Sky Panels, your Sky Convergence System, all through setting to its operation signal. Okay, it's all set up. And set lines of wire signatures as set travel. Okay, so now we go through high centers, directing low center spectrum into wire signature lines of center operation signal. Okay, now we work with that position with row graphs. Now the cells come in information bits. Okay, they center, of course, centers in the atoms. Atom roots to routers. They go through transistors over resistors over pi in generation screen. Okay, they platted to the walking screens, electrical line core centers to assembly line of 3, setting of 4 travels of communication convergence. Directing inside line connection setting, convergence system, and protocol systems, and channels of operation lines of panel. Set to operation lines of ground centers, one signals, location setting, electrical line core centers, and position. So you're all connected to your subunits, all through mind of telepathy and flash drive interference of Saturn operation. Saturn of operation lines, Mercury over rotations, Jupiter over calculation setting information panel, and position Neptune as center communication convergence of operation lines of calculation. That's all set up in travel calculations. All right, done by equation. All right, so that it's amazing how you see the expanding of the bandwidth just by all signals and location lines of grounds. You work with inside line condition setting, then you can see the electrical communication to its infusion, rotation to its VR system and travel. Sets calculation ground centers of sequence, location system, all through calculations. Webbing system lines of travel. Okay. All right, so we go through the void lines. Okay, so we go outside travel. Okay, inside position. All right. So it's a mapping outline rotations. The travel indicates the setting of flux. Okay. So if you look at the formation lines of grounds, you set course centers communicates to its settings, so its operation set location to its mapping system. All through calculations. Brain convergence, done by equation. Right? There's your face recognition. Right? It's all done. Now you got the face line. Now we have to get in position to graph calculation, screen location setting, pixelation grounds, and communication setting T receptor. So you got a floating head and now in sequence. So how this is all set up now we got to get position and convergence system to your body now and get out of the consignments and get position out of the solid matterity, or course centers of solid matterity, location setting to all course center convergence system interactions, coming into position of its body frame and circulation frame into the ground frame, set positions, all through set lines of travel. Okay, that's next. This is done. Now we're working on this. So coming into your full configuration setting of wire signatures and panels of screens and TV reception lines and 4 box frames and set lines of calculation. Okay? So now you're walking symbolism, floating heads in rotation. Congratulations. Now we just got to work on your body. TV reception lines and fusion overlying electrical line grids set indicates settings and operation lines of signals, location of system, author calculation. Okay, so go through all lines. Set course centers into resistors. Set course centers to infusion over lines into all levels of receivers and rotation lines of grounds. Inside, outside rotation, travel, communications, and convergence. Outside signals done by equation. Flux capacitor. All right, so we change course center timeline centers to time capacitor, which is energetic fusing, so 3 centers of scale. Right, set lines of travel. Directing ground centers moving over the signals. Remember, the planetary line in the course centers to change communicates setting empty memory. Both line course centers to all memory itself is converting the set position location in 1000 line measure and scale infinity on one cycle into 9 trimesters lines in time frame, time lock, time screen, time calculation, times pi. So that puts position lines on high centers of void itself into 3 centers, okay, in convergence set position. Into operation lines into all levels of body alignment, into high course centers, 3 centers of scale of communication with settings all through traction. Done by equation, right? It's all set up in set lines of communication. Okay, working with the O center, operation line sequence of data processing lines of link, indicates all position lines of high positions. Pink charge directing online signals of communication with settings. It's operation system. Done by equation. All right. Working with all that in set lines of calculation and face recognition, pattern recognition. Done by equation. All set of operation done. Okay? All right, so I know it's a lot to take in from what's going on in that position. Okay? Very complicated. Very, very extremely confusing. But it's a lot more understanding how you come into your open signals, open panels, open line course centers, coming out of the memory, flushing out your system location, coming to your data processing system, and starting to understand how to use your optical systems, your data operating settings to machines, into itself, into the higher self, into the avatar, into the sim of infusion. Now you're working with the online position of Simulate that has to release everything to its full alignment, so readjust the system into settings, come into the concordance and solidarity, out of the line position of solidarity, get out of the density, toxicity of the story itself. So it can process its communication settings, so it go into its process lines, hardwired its set location to its setting, understand through its processing, become its own data programmer of itself, set modification to itself, and travel communications to its system. All done through its operation. All right? So that's it. Hope you enjoy that. See you in 5.